So this is a review of chapter 5 of your textbook, a chapter that covers the 6th and 7th books of the Old Testament, the book of Joshua and Judges. And for sake of choosing C-lettered words that help you remember the direction and the story overall, they have chosen conquest as the major word to remember the book of Joshua, and Canaanization, the word to remember the book of Judges. One is a very positive, a great moment in the history of the children of Israel, and the second one is far less than that, absolutely the opposite, a story of how things can go terribly wrong when they had finally gone very right. So conquest, Joshua, and Canaanization, Judges. Canaanization is the being conquered by those whom you conquered. Conquest is the children of Israel conquering the promised land, and Canaanization is the conquest of the Canaanite culture of the children of Israel, the influence that they had on them after having been defeated by them militarily. They conquered the children of Israel culturally and religiously, and that led to absolutely the demise of the children of Israel. Here is a quick map of the arrival, the direction. Look at the green arrow following from the land of Moab. So you see in your map before you the Dead Sea. You see the Jordan River flowing from the north into it. You see the children of Israel coming through the land of Moab on the eastern side of the Jordan River and then crossing over it. That's going to be a very important, critical moment, crossing in the Jordan River into the promised land, so to speak. And then, of course, they immediately encounter Jericho, the first citadel of the Canaanites, a fortified city, and we'll talk about quickly that story. And then they proceed into other citadels like Ai and Bethel, and then head south. And we're going to look at that conquest of the promised land, the war efforts to get rid of the pagan Canaanites that had settled in the promised land, the land that had been promised by God to Abraham, while the descendants of Abraham were in captivity in Egypt. A pagan, immoral, highly disobedient to God people had settled in this land, and they had to be dispossessed. Here is another map of that conquest where you see the crossing again of the Jordan River just north of the Dead Sea, and then the descent into the southern parts of Israel, and then the second phase of the conquest of the north all the way up to the areas of Galilee and the Sea of Galilee. So that's the second phase. I'll go ahead and make note here that the concept of the promised land is really not a large portion of land. It's Israel today, and even ancient Israel. The promised land is a small area of territory, nothing like any of our larger states like Texas or others like that, a very small territorial area. But and it extends from about the city of Beersheba, if you're looking way down on the bottom part of your map, and then look way up at the top, the city of Damascus. So the area of the promised land, ancient Israel, and even modern day Israel extend basically between those two major cities on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, flanked on the right side by the bodies of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee. Now, some of the tribes of Israel, 3 of them, will actually spill over, and there will be lands across the Jordan River that will also be settled by the 12 tribes of Israel, but 9 of them in particular will be all in that western side of the Jordan River, and that is very important. So, as you drop into the book of Joshua, the historical book of the conquest of the Promised Land by the Israelites, led by Joshua, there are two major strands, your text points out, two major leading ideas that lead you into the book of Joshua. One, the concept of the promised land. God had promised this land to the children of Israel. He's going to deliver. One whole generation is not going to get to go in because they disobeyed and they die in the desert. But the descendants, the next generation of the children of Israel, will get to enter. They're going to have to work for it. They're going to have to follow God's instructions. But the first idea is the concept, the idea of promised land. God promised Abraham 5 centuries before to give him a land to his people, and he is giving it back to them, or to them, and he is about to lead them into it away from the slavery in Egypt. The promised land is supposed to be a place of blessing, empowered and sanctified, made to be a blessing by the presence of God. But of course, God does not just live anywhere, and he does not live amongst the people without conditions. So those conditions need to be remembered. If you want the promised land, you have to remember that God is required to be there, and for him to be there, there are some requirements. The second major strand or idea leads into the book of Joshua is the idea of commandments. This is how you'll know how you stand if you obey the specific commandments that God gave you. You have a choice. You are not forced. You are not bludgeoned into obedience. You are given free will. But the commandments are like a road, a highway to blessings. If you choose to get off of them, you will pay a price. You will be lost. You will not encounter those blessings. The book of Deuteronomy, the fifth of the Pentateuch of the Torah, clearly reiterated the importance of abiding by the commandments that God gave the people of Israel. The question is, will the Israelites obey Deuteronomy and be blessed? There's a kind of an implication in that question, which is, well, if you have to ask it, then there must be an upcoming problem. Yes and no. You will see in Joshua that as long as they have the right kind of leadership and follow it, they'll be fine. When they start getting sketchy leadership or doing of their own free will, well, then things will turn sour very quickly. So it's about faith and then disobedience. Joshua and Judges. And the story of the conquest of the promised land and then their residing in it starts with a quick siege of a fortified city. This quick siege of Jericho immediately hits you as you enter the first few chapters of the book of John. So when the priests broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground while Israel passed until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. This is going to be one of many reminders that the story of salvation involves water. In the New Testament, interestingly enough, the picture of the story of salvation as God delivers us from sin and leads us into a new life of blessing goes through water. It's called baptism. So water, it is something that is used to destroy with the Noah, but then God promises, see the rainbow, to never use that again, and water becomes an important symbol of salvation, crossing over to the side from sin to salvation. Very important, poignant moment. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with us king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. Before I leave this text and continue and look at the amazing event that happens right after they cross the Jordan River, let me highlight the importance of numbers again. As soon as they cross over, and I'll show you those images, as soon as they cross over, Jericho hits them. And Jericho is a fortified walled city that's been in existence for centuries, if not millennia. And the Canaanites have inhabited it and fortified it, and they've heard of the victories of the Israelites in the against kings across the river, and they take refuge inside their high walls. And God gives the children of Israel, who don't have siege towers, don't have major military machinery, don't have any of that, he simply says, you don't need it. All you need is me on your side. But here are some specifics. To show your faith, I want you to march around the city for 6 days. On the seventh, you are to march around 7 times and blow your ram's horn. God gives some, you could say, highly strange, might seem specifics, but it is a test. It is not like an abracadabra or magic wand, but it is a test of their faith. They do exactly as he says, so they will give total credit to God for the conquest of this highly fortified Canaanite city. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Now, most would say, sure, all you have to do is yell and major walls come a-tumbling down. Well, that is not the way it happens normally. But if God is stepping into human history, then he will set the terms by which something like this will happen. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And here we see them obey to the specifics, and therefore, when the trumpets sound, the army shouted. At the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. Totally befuddled and surprised. The Canaanites on the ramparts of the walls see themselves crumbling down, their defenses completely leveled, and they with them, and therefore all the children of Israel have to do is walk in without the standard ways in which in ancient times you might have collapsed a wall. The lesson is one of obedience. Just do what God says. He's not going to make you, but if you don't, then no, you're not going to be blessed by what humanly is impossible. They could not have brought down the walls of Jericho. Obedience and faith in the Lord will lead to tremendous successes, unexpected successes, and blessings in the task God has called the Israelites to complete, which is to work hard, but with his faith in him and his complete help to conquer, to wrestle the promised land from pagan, corrupt, immoral pagan people that have settled it over the last 400 plus years that the children of Israel have been gone into Egypt. Here are some quick images, because lest we think again in terms of mythology, made up stories, it seems hard, especially from a skeptical point of view, to believe that walls came a-tumbling down just because somebody marched around them and shouted. But here are the here's a bird's eye view of the landscape in which this takes place. Please look at the top part of the picture. You'll see the mountains on the other side of the Jordan River, which are the high plains of what we call the country of Jordan today. That's, by the way, are the high plains mountains, and Mount Nebo is among those, Mount Nebo being the mountain where Moses is buried because he died on the wrong side of the Jordan River. Moses was a great leader, but he also had some faults, in particular his temper. And because of that, God will not allow him to march across the Jordan River. It will be Joshua that will lead the children of Israel. So in those mountains is buried Moses, overlooking. He can see from his high peak perspective when he dies the promised land. Now look at the Jordan River, again, not a big one, but a small one here, right before it enters to the right side of your picture into the Dead Sea. You see on the lower part of your picture, it's the western side of the Jordan River, and that is what the children of Israel have crossed, and Jericho is going to be just the left side of outside of our picture as I show you other images. So flat land actually below sea level in some ways, and while the high plains and mountains way above sea level are just across the Jordan River. Here is again an image viewing to the east. So you're looking at Mount Nebo, and you're looking at the snaking of the Jordan River in the lower part, and then you're seeing the land into which the children of Israel crossed. Here is looking now further westward. You see the modern-day city of Jericho, modern-day Israel, and we're going to go drop down from this high bird's-eye view of it, and we're going to drop down in the excavations of the Jericho of 35 centuries ago that was brought down by the children of Israel. Notice, please, that on the upper left side you see mountains again. That's the high plains of the high chains of mountains and high plateau of Israel on the western side. The promised land is made of plains, it's made of beaches and low living, but it's made of high plains and plateaus. And Jerusalem is only 12 miles by bird's eye southeast of this, but you have to climb significantly, as Jerusalem is nearly 3,000 feet up in the air, while right now you're looking at where Jericho was, just over the Jordan River and before you start climbing the mountains. Here is dropping in to the modern day Jericho. Here you see up at the top part of the picture again the mountains that are on the that are part of Israel, promised land, that you have to climb to get to Jerusalem. But down in the lower part there's this excavations. Here they are as we're looking at them, at the citadel, the fortress, the rock that was Jericho back 3,500 years ago. Now, let me go ahead and say this. Jericho was inhabited for several thousands of years, not only from where you and I sit, but also had long been inhabited before even the Canaanites. So there are several levels that the archaeologists have found in the excavations of Jericho, which was built up and destroyed many times. But much like, for example, in the city of Troy, of the Trojan War, narrated in the poem of Homer called the Iliad. Well, archaeologists in the 19th century, Schliemann, found not just one level, but 7 different levels of that particular city, which is in modern-day Turkey. But the question was, can we find the level, what he asked himself on that occasion in the city of Troy, can I find the level that's destroyed by the Greeks, as narrated in the Trojan War or in the Iliad? Well, here the question is, can we be sure of the walls that were built up and then destroyed by God, not by the children of Israel, in the 15th century before Christ? And many archaeologists believe that that has been found. Some of you wrote on that in their archaeology paper. So here are now coming down to the ground the excavations of the ancient city of Jericho, and what many archaeologists have defined as the walls that were brought down not by the children of Israel, but by God himself. Here is what some archaeologists point to you and I. This is kind of like what's called a bulk. It's how archaeology does things today. It doesn't just dig up, down, but it actually leaves segments, walls, bulks, so that you can see various levels of a city, destruction and rebuilding. And some point to this, even though your eye and mine is not trained, as the level of the collapsed wall of Jericho. Here is maybe a better image that shows us on the right side the foundational revetment wall. See those larger stones. And on top of that was where there was the mud brick or the rest of the top of the walls of Jericho that God had collapsed so that the children of Israel can simply walk in and conquer Jericho with complete ease. Here is one of the archaeologists pointing to what they point out as the collapsed part of the walls, and therefore identifying it with the 15th century before Christ sudden instantaneous collapse of Jericho because God stepped into history, and the children of Israel conquered it in easy fashion thanks to his intervention. The other interesting story, besides the collapse of the walls of Jericho as God hands us this fortified rock over, is that of a woman, a Canaanite woman, even so a prostitute. Rahab is the name. So we're going to do in our quick survey, as your book does, a quick look at an example of how to do things right. And then what will follow is a highlight of how to do things wrong. Bad choices, good choices. Very much stories that teach a moral lesson in contrast and are surprising in the characters involved. Rahab is not only a prostitute, but she's not an Israelite. She's a Canaanite. And she actually lives within those walls before they are brought down. And she harbors Israelite spies that come to look at the defense forces and the garrisons and the enemy, you could say, from inside. And she gives refuge to Israelite spies. She is born in a pagan culture that worships pagan gods and okays prostitution. But she turns and believes in the God of Israel. And should be no surprise, she finds deliverance from destruction in her change, in her choices that she makes, even though we might see this as an unlikely candidate. A Canaanite prostitute will see deliverance on the part of God. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, so this is Rahab talking to the Israelite spies, which she harbors in her house at her own risk. And she says to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and when you did what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. I'll continue the reading in a moment, but just something to emphasize here. The Canaanites, the people of Jericho, get the message of 40 years before, how they have fled Egypt and the chasing army of Pharaoh, and God preserved them to the Red Sea. And they hear about the destruction of two Amorite kings on the other side, and they live in fear. However, what follows with Rahab is she comes to the conclusion, declaration, faith that their God, Lord, your God Yahweh, is the God of heaven above and Lord of the earth below. So this is her words. Now then, please swear to me, she says to the spies, by the Lord, that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, that you will save us from death. So please see that the choice of a Canaanite prostitute to believe in God and to repent and change leads to the salvation of not just herself, but of all of her family as well. And that is a promise that she extracts out of the spies. Now, the contrasting contrasting to the story of Rahab, which we quickly surveyed, is the story of Achan, and it's told in the beginning chapters of the book of Joshua as well. Achan is an example of how to not do things. Achan is an example of bad, evil leadership within a family. If Rahab is an example of how her actions save her family, this is an example of how a Israelite head of a family brings ruin upon his own family by his own choices, leadership, etc. It's a story of greed. It's a story of material possessions influencing a man to fudge, to hesitate to follow God's orders to the hilt specifically. God had commanded not to take anything that belonged to the pagan people in the cities that they were conquering. God's commands about hoarding loot from conquered cities was clear. It was not confusing. And yet Achan takes exception because of greed, and therefore judgment will come upon what could be seen as a cancer that starts growing within the body of the community of the people of Israel, and which has to be severed, has to be addressed immediately, because it's an example of taking exception with God. God will live among you if, and Achan has violated the if. The Israelites were unfaithful to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, and of the tribe of Judah, took some of them, so the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Again, anger here is a human emotion, human term. God is righteous, God is holy. He clearly gives not just one chance, but multiple chances. But when man, by his own volition and fully knowing that you can't hide anything from God, when he decides to fudge or take exception, well, then the blessings will not be had, but the cursing. And God has every right. He's the creator of life. He can take life. It is his call. Achan is not an innocent victim of divine violence. That is not the way the story plays out. Achan replied when he's discovered, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord God. This is what I did. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath." When asked the question, why would you need to hide that stuff? Hide it from men or hide it from God? Or hide it from both? Well, you can hide it from men. You can put on a facade before men. You can never hide it from God. And of course, this is him admitting that that's what he had tried to do. The leadership of Joshua may seem brutal here, but it is God who pronounces judgment on Achan. Joshua, together with all Israel, took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold bar, his sons, daughters, his cattle, donkeys and sheep, his tents, and all that he had, to the valley of Achor. Joshua said, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you." So Joshua's words to him are, "You have brought a disease, a deadly disease, within the Israel camp. And it is God's judgment that is now going to be executed." And then, brutal as it may seem to us, all of Israel stoned him. And after they had stoned the rest, they burned them. Over Achan they heaped a large pile of rocks, which remains to this day. Then the Lord turned from his fierce anger. Therefore, that place has been called the Valley of Achor ever since, whereby Achor means trouble. It's the Valley of Trouble. Achan brought trouble into the children of Israel, into the camp, and it had to be severed, much like a doctor, once it finds a cancer, has to sever it. That is what happens to not just him, but all of his family. Remember, Achan would not have buried all of that stuff in his tent without the knowledge and consent of his family. They are responsible too. Everything connected with Achan sees the judgment of God. Now they are two different stories in this quick bird's eye view of the first few chapters of Joshua. There is from outside, from the enemy side, there's a story of redemption, of salvation. Rahab, in a most unlikely, character, a Canaanite prostitute, a woman. On the other hand, there is a family leader being blessed by God, coming into the promised land, who takes exception to God's command, and therefore he is going to be an example of what not to do. Here you see in prints over the centuries, one from the Middle Ages on the left, the stoning of Achan, and on the right, here a woodcut with the figure of Rahab, which comes from a psalter, comes from a woodcut of a book in centuries ago. The story of Rahab resonating significantly, not only in the Old Testament, but into the New by far. The point is that you are to look carefully. The spotlight is put on how you can be the right DNA and the right, born in the right family, and do the wrong thing. On the other hand, you can be outside, dwelling among the enemies of God, and yet choose to repent, to serve God, and be blessed and saved by him. So Rahab is a Gentile. She's a non-Jew. And Gentiles who believe in and obey God can be included among the people of God. So it's not about DNA descending from the right father, mother, etc. Israelites like Achan who disobey will be excluded, joining unbelievers in judgment. Carry that idea, that concept into the Christianity, the modern day. The new children of Israel is anybody that chooses to obey God. It's not just about being a Jew or a Hebrew or descendants of Abraham. It's about doing the will of God. Now, the next few chapters, the last chapters of Joshua, are about the rest of the war required to finish conquering the promised land from the pagan Canaanites, and then dividing up the land. That's what is the major subject of Joshua chapter 9 through 22. So, in brief, to cover very quickly these chapters, the children of Israel will cross the Jordan into Jericho, and then from there they'll take a left turn and go into the southern cities and defeat the Canaanites in those southern parts of the promised land. Then they will turn to the north and defeat the resistance of the Canaanite forces and citadels and cities in the north. And then, in most of the chapters of Joshua, the rest of it will be the process of dividing up, settling into the land of the 12 tribes of Israel. God has led them into the conquest of the promised land, and that is the story of the book of Joshua. Here is a black and white map of how those 12 tribes settle. If that is not as evident, maybe this one is a little easier. So you see there are 3 tribes that spill into the right side in your map, or eastern side of the Jordan River: Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. Manasseh actually has a large geographical extension, because part of Manasseh is on the western side as well. So please notice Manasseh is mentioned twice, but there is the division of the 12 tribes of Israel throughout the promised land, most of it being on, of course, the western side of the Jordan River. There are also listed here some of the cities of refuge: Hebron, Bezer, Shechem, Kadesh, Ramoth Gilead, and Golan. That is cities where an Israelite could run to seek refuge, appointed places where if they didn't feel like they were getting a fair shake um, uh, from local justice, well, then they could, cities of refuge were set up. But that's a story that we won't take time to tell, but those are what are contained, spread out throughout the various tribes, various cities where uh, uh, that are called cities of refuge. Joshua chapter 21. The Lord gave Israel all the land that he had sworn to give to their ancestors. They took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them the rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled. When God speaks, it happens. When God makes promises, he fulfills them. And more importantly, everything that they gained was by the efforts of God. Because God was with them, things like that happened. So the story of Joshua is a story of faithfulness and the blessings that come from it. Joshua, their leader, is faithful to God, and the nation chooses to follow his leadership and therefore are blessed. God blesses and empowers Israel to fulfill its tasks of re-entering the promised land and reestablishing um, his presence in their midst in the promised land. So they settle in the land, and if Israel can maintain that kind of faithfulness that led them under the leadership of Joshua to conquer the land, well, then they can anticipate a time of blessing and rest. Now that they are out of slavery and have done the hard work with God's help of retaking the land. However, of course, there seem to be two sides of a coin, tragically speaking, and that's where we look at the second book. Now, before I leave these events, please notice that in these pages of war of Joshua, and in moments coming up, definitely in the book of Judges, it may be disturbing to some to see the orders that God gives to kill Achan and all of his family and all of his animals, and etc. It may be disturbing to some modern spirits to conceive of a God that's supposed to be of love to order his people to kill. Um, just a few things that I will note, starting with the fact that if God is God, then he gives life and he can choose to take life anytime he wishes. There's no innocent murder on the part of God. If God takes life, it wasn't innocent. It was his will. It was his choice. Um, so that's an important point even before you consider a few other points that I'll make, which are, God did not transform the children of Israel into a warrior class, warrior culture. War was necessary to dispossess the Canaanites. They were not going to move, get out, and they definitely were not uh, uh, worshippers of the one true God. So the orders to kill only applied to cities that God needed the children of Israel to conquer in the promised land. Secondly, the Canaanites, they were well known and are well known by everything we have of them, of being extraordinarily immoral and very corrupt in their practices and means, religiously, sexually, and many other ways. You can read, if you like, more about that as recorded in Genesis 19 and the book of Leviticus chapter 18. So the Canaanites are the despicable culture. They're not morally neutral, so to speak. Not definitely if you look at it from the perspective of God, who created them. Third, this judgment uh, of God, these are immoral people. It's not that God gave them 1 year, 1 month to change, or else he would give them into the hands of Israelites. They had been this way and living this way and heading towards immorality and corruption for centuries. Please notice back in Genesis 15, a long time before, that the judgment of God upon these pagan people who had made their own gods and were making up ways of living, choices of living, were despicable in God's eyes. So God had pronounced judgment on them, not in a short time, but over a period of centuries. They had centuries to change, do things the right way. Also, please remember that God did spare some of the Canaanites in the city of Jericho. Her name is Rahab, and the rest of her family. Rahab is the exception that confirms the rule. That is, and Rahab is right there at the beginning of the narrative. So you will keep in mind that God is not a violent, irrational divine who takes vengeance on people irrationally. God actually lays out the conditions for being blessed, and the Canaanites couldn't care less about the conditions of God and haven't for centuries. Mr. Copeland, one of the commentators, says this about this topic. In Old Testament Israel's physical battles, God wanted to show forth his greatness, not a display of sheer human power. And though the true Israel, the church, doesn't wage war against flesh and blood, see the book of Ephesians, verse 12, today, our warfare against Satan and his hosts has its roots in Yahweh's, God's wars in the Old Testament. So he invites us to make the parallel. Children of Israel had to fight physical battles, but those were only representative of cultural, religious, spiritual battles. They had to fight with weapons. Christians, the new Israel, the new covenant, we're not called to fight with weapons, to fight, but we are at war. It is a spiritual war, and these Old Testament wars are a foreshadowing, a moment of teaching in which God says, if you're going to be on my side, when you get up in the morning, you're going to have to face an enemy that's going to oppose you. You are at war. That's what Paul says in the book of Ephesians. He says, put on your armor and look across the battlefield at the spiritual enemy across there. You're going to need to be at war. You can't compromise with the enemy. He will bring you down. You're either on my side or you're on their side. The book of Judges is a sad story. Sad story in the story of the children of Israel, descendants of Abraham. It's about a downward spiral. It's about growing disobedience, while Joshua is about faithfulness. Judges is about the growing presence and therefore cost of disobedience to God. Here's a quick rundown of some things about the book of Judges. We're not sure exactly who wrote it. Most suggest Samuel, a prophet that comes in the 11th century, wrote it looking back on the 3 centuries before. There are some scholars that point to maybe more than one author, multiple authors. Again, that can't be completely ascertained. But it does cover the book of Judges, not just 40 years or the life of one leader like the book of Joshua, but it covers about 3 centuries. And specifically, since I have taken the early date of the Exodus in the 15th, it covers therefore about from the 14th to the 11th century of the children of Israel's stay settling in the promised land. There are 12 judges, 12 leaders. See again the importance of that number, 3, 12, 40, you see numbers. 12 judges. These judges are not just like in our society, we have 3 powers, the executive being one, that's the one that applies power, the judicial being one that does the laws. And they mix both civil and military, the judges here that rule parts or tribes of the children of Israel during these 3 centuries. It is a story of a downward spiral, increasingly. It is a story of apostasy, rebellion, getting away from. Another image or metaphor you could use, Joshua was on the right road, leading to the right place, faith, obedience to God, while in Judges we see people getting off the highway and forgetting, choosing not to dial up God, choosing to do it their own way, go their own way, and therefore getting complete lost. One of the things that will kind of pop up as a question, well, is this a good way for the children of Israel to self-govern themselves, their polity, judges? Is a judge a good way to do politics? Is a monarchy or a king not better? That issue will come up, but the answer will not be in a system of politics. It will be on obedience to God or not. When the book of Joshua ends, it ends fairly serenely. It's serene in the sense peaceful. Joshua says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Now, it does leave kind of hanging now. What will the rest of the people do? What will the leaders that come after him when he dies, what will the people do? Judges ends, when it concludes its story, very ominously. Oh my, oh dear, oh dear. It ends with words that we will read again when we get there. Everyone did what was good in their own eyes. This is not good. Joshua ends with, I'm going to do what's good in God's eyes. Judges ends with, everybody did what was good in their own eyes. Now, a question that might be asked before we quickly survey detail the story of 3 centuries of corruption of the children of Israel under the judges. Why were the Israelites, who conquered militarily the Canaanites, took over their cities and their lands, their vineyards and their olive groves, why did they let themselves be corrupted by these pagan people? Some would say, well, look, the Israelites came from 40 years of wandering in a desert, and then they marched into organized cities, planted vineyards, and a culture that was pagan but had running water, more sophisticated art, literature, architecture, trade systems, political organizations, i.e. kings, if a monarchy is more sophisticated than judges. They will say, look, when they conquered them, they must have thought, wow, these people may be pagans, but they're sophisticated. So they were impressed with the sophistication of the culture, maybe. But here's another factor. The Canaanite culture was highly sexualized, meaning not only houses of prostitution were evident and practiced, the practice was everywhere, but it also spilled into religious rituals, sex in the name of the gods having sex, all kinds of a hyper-sexualized environment, which might remind some of our culture today. The Canaanite culture definitely was that, while the Hebrew culture, children of Israel, of course, had specific rules with regard to how and when this God created aspect of the human condition, sex, was to be practiced and seen, and what role it was to have. The highly sexualized orientation of the Canaanites may have tragically serve as one of the corrupting factors of the children of Israel. Here is another map of, again, the settled land of Israel, and some of the major cities, centers that were there, and in this land on the western side of the Jordan River. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua, said the book of Joshua, who outlived him, and the elders who outlived him, who had seen all the great things the Lord had done. This is a good moment in the children of Israel's history, as spotlighted in Joshua chapter. To that slide, the cycle, growing cycle, increasing in speed, presence begins. The book of Judges is about a cycle of individually, collectively, Israel turning away from God. They decide to not do exactly what God did. Then God says, well, let's see how you do without me. And foreign enemies, oppressors, pagans are then allowed by God because He doesn't stop them to come in. They become instruments of God as they become oppressors and attack and take away their freedom and much more to segments of the children of Israel. They then repent, regret. They suffer greatly under foreign dominations. They pray to God, uh, repent momentarily. God relents and delivers them, and He uses judges who are military leaders on many occasions to deliver disobedient Israelites or portions of the tribes of Israel from an outside enemy. But of course, you see that this is a cycle. It doesn't happen once. It happens repeatedly over the arch of 3 centuries, and it increases in magnitude and in speed. A judge is not a king, is not a president. What's a judge? He's not just what we call a judge today. I mentioned before he has civil and military duties, and sometimes even religious, as a prophet, spokesman for God. Overall, judge is a tribal leader within these 3 centuries of the nation of Israel's history that God raised up. So they are the right person at the beginning of their ministry, of their service. Their job is to deliver Israel normally from oppressors that God has allowed to oppress the children of Israel because of their disobedience. So they're sent to fix what the children of Israel broke. So they're the right person at the beginning of their story. Take an example of a few. We're not going to look at all of them. Othniel is described as man of good character. He's one of those judges that delivers Israel from a Mesopotamian oppressor. There are some that see at the end of the narrative that talks about him, just a few verses in chapter 3 of Judges. Maybe did he leave the door open, even though he got rid of the physical enemy? Did he leave the door open for his people, the people of Israel, to adopt pagan gods, to did he turn the people away or to the worship of God? Did he finish the job that he's supposed to do? He freed them from pagan oppressor, but did he free them from pagan worship is the question. Ehud is another one that's narrated, a few verses. He has a particular narrative in which he's going to pay taxes, a tribute to a pagan king, King Eglon, a Moabite king that has been allowed to God to oppress the children of Israel because of their disobedience. And he serves as an instrument of God as he smuggles an 18-inch weapon, sword, a knife, in his right hand. He smuggles it in, and then he asks for be in the presence only of the king, and the king dismisses his attendants, and he thrusts the blade into the large figure of King Eglon and buries it to the hilt, kills him, and then he manages to escape by saying the king in more alone time. So he kills a pagan foreign enemy king, rescues children of Israel from a foreign entity. There are stories like that of Deborah, a woman who fulfills her role as both a judge and a prophetess, so a spokesman for God. Not all judges are prophets, so to speak, but she is described in terms of faith and heroism. 2 chapters are dedicated to her role during these times, and she is kind of in contrast to the cowardice, her heroism, to that of Barak, who was called to lead the Israel into battle, and he doesn't fulfill that, while Deborah rises to the occasion. Maybe you've heard the story of Gideon. It takes up 3 chapters of the book of Judges. He is overall a good character, a good role within this, his life and his story, but he is complex too. A reminder that none of these characters are are perfect, infallible. They have weaknesses. From the very introduction of this character, he seems to be a man who needs a significant proof of the presence of God. He demands about 3 different tests of God to make sure that God really wants him to do what God is calling him to do. He wants sign after sign. He seems to have somewhat of a lack of faith, and because of that, when he leads the children of Israel, God will do a strange thing and whittle down the large army that Gideon has at his disposal down multiple times. He whittles it down to a minimum core of 300 warriors, so that no one will doubt who is going to win the victory. It's not Gideon and his military prowess. It's because Gideon has God. The children of Israel have God on their side. They're going to defeat an enemy that outnumbers them many times over. Now, Gideon is positive in the sense that he seems to be very active in not just defeating the physical pagan enemy of the children of Israel, but in defeating the spiritual enemy of Israel, more importantly. That is, he leads to repentance. He finishes the job. He cleans the temple out, and then he restores the worship of the one true God. That is an important thing to remember about Gideon. Now, at the close of his story, he does fashion a golden ephod, which is kind of a priestly garment that has no sleeves. And it seems that the last image we have of his family is of worshiping this garment instead of God. Of course, that was one of the most dangerous things. God said to Moses, to the children of Israel, no graven images, don't worship physical items. God is spirit. Jephthah shows the corruption of some of the judges. While he is the right guy at the beginning, he is so influenced that he makes a vow that he shouldn't have, that God doesn't call him to do, and when he keeps it, he it provides a grotesque page in the history of the children of Israel. So Jephthah vows to God that if God is going to give him a victory, then he's going to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house. And I reckon he meant a lamb or a sheep. But when his daughter comes through, he carries through with human sacrifice. A daughter sacrifices her own son. Reminder to you that Jehovah never did intend Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. God had always in mind the ram in the thicket. That was the plan. Here, God didn't require the vow of Jephthah. Jephthah made it, and then Jephthah kept it because he was highly influenced by Canaanite culture. By the way, the Canaanites and pagan cultures in those ancient times, some did practice human sacrifice, some on a large scale. This shows the disturbing influence of pagan religion on some moments of the story of the children of Israel. Samson, you may know him, but let's get one thing straight from the beginning. The power of Samson did not lie in his hair, even though the length of his hair is going to be a symbol of something. There's a difference in the Bible between Nazirite and Nazarene. And part of that confusion will lead people to think that Jesus had long hair. We have no images of Jesus for the first 4 or more centuries of early Christianity. But the image of a long-haired Jesus comes from a misunderstanding. Jesus was not a Nazirite, he was a Nazarene, i.e., while he grew up or was born in Bethlehem, he grew up for 28 years of his life in the city of Nazareth, a small village in Galilee called Nazareth. Therefore, Jesus was a Nazarene from the village of Nazareth. Nazarite is the name of a vow or a dedication, a consecration. Mother of Samson dedicated him to service to God. That's a Nazarite vow. And part of that is that in the such an individual would be compelled to honor certain practices, such as no drinking of alcoholic beverage. Number one on the list you have in the slide before you. Having no contact with carcasses of dead animals, dead human beings, etc. And thirdly, not cutting their hair would be a sign of a vow kept. Now, in the New Testament times, Orthodox Jews practice Nazirite vows, but those vows are not permanent. Normally, they're temporary. For example, you will see, if you want to, that the Apostle Paul will have a personal vow he will practice with God. We don't know the details. And he will signify the end of that vow when he cuts his hair. So it was never intended that the hair would never be cut when you took a Nazirite vow. Now, Samson is dedicated by his mom in his entire life. So, yes, the long hair is a feature of his Nazirite life vow. So, the power doesn't lie in the hair, coming back to the story of Samson in the book of Judges. He is given great strength by God, but strength is not in the hair, but in the vow of consecration. At least that's one way of understanding it. And when Samson, who is the right man for the job, starts taking exception to very specific aspects of his role as a Nazirite, well, when he drinks wine at a festival, a pagan festival, Philistine, when he has contact with a dead corpse, and especially when he, after being married, Delilah, and she leads him to a moment of stupor and sleep and lack of control, you could say. She then cuts his hair. Well, then he is exposed to how you're going to do or be when God leaves you because you violated his conditions for being with you. So he finds himself powerless, grabbed by envoys of the Philistine princes, houses of royalty of the Philistines, pagan Canaanite people, and he is blinded, his eyes are gouged out, and he's tied to posts. And of course, you may remember the rest of the story, which has the Canaanites killed by the fact that Samson, in his blinded last moments of life, recovers his faith in God and his trust in God, has his power restored, and thus he brings down the pillars that were supporting the house in which the Canaanite Philistine people were. By the way, Samson made several mistakes, not just marrying Delilah, a Philistine woman, but what is recorded also, he had relations with 2 other plus women. So flawed, sometimes deeply flawed individuals pay a high price, even though they had great potential. Now, some of these judges have a surprisingly to some positive spin or look in the New Testament, in particular in the New Testament book of Hebrews, in what's called the Hall of Faith chapter 11. And you will find from verse 32 to 33 that some of these judges, which seem to be bad news, but some of them are highlighted as having a measure of faith that is to be imitated. But clearly in the stories that we have in the book of Judges, they're not consistent. They have sometimes some bad endings. They are not consistent models of faith and virtue, but they are, in some aspects, models of faith. And that's, I guess, the important thing. You want to imitate some of the judges in the good things they did. You don't want to follow them in the moments of their weakness or their demise. This is the book of Hebrews. This is what it says. What more shall we say, says the Hebrew writer. Maybe it's Barnabas or Paul For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through their faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. What's being emphasized by the writer here is that not that they were perfect, but that God used them even in their imperfect actions. And when God was allowed to use them, it was because of their faith, and things happened, and people were saved, and the children of Israel were helped, made strong in weakness, and put foreign armies to flight. Through their actions. Again, this is emphasizing the positive moments of faith in some of these Old Testament judges. Here are some, there are many images, paintings, sculptures of these Old Testament prophets. This is Samson's Delilah, the moment in which his hair is being cut, the moment that is the apex of his weakness, with which he will pay, for which he will pay a high price. The Samson and Delilah narrative has been one that's resonated quite a lot since it played out 35 centuries ago. Samson appears to serve kind of as a symbol to Israel. While the potential things were so amazing, incredibly gifted, powerful, full of potential, but tragically when you choose to ignore God, you fritter that power away. It's kind of like you knew where your strengths lie, and then you let yourself get a haircut. Yet there's that narrative of Hebrews that reminds us that God uses imperfect individuals to carry out his overall plan. Judges 17 through 21 is a story that is very hard to read because it describes total anarchy. That means you don't know where the good has gone. Only evil seems to pervade. Moral collapse of the children of Israel. The Israelites demonstrate that they have become just like Canaanites, and I'll make reference as this medieval picture of the concubine, the the Hebrew Levite's concubine, and her end and her demise in the city of Gibeah. That I'm going to make quick reference to that as one of the saddest pages in the history of the children of Israel. There is, however, before I get to that, other instances of corruption of the children of Israel. In Judges 17, there's the story of Micah, not to be confused with a prophet that will come later. He's actually a thief who steals from his own mother. The mother surprisingly forgives him, and then we see the mother and the son in cahoots, who begin absolutely taking steps towards abandoning what they know to be good and true, as they build a shrine and enshrine an ephod, again a garment. Instead of worshiping the God of Spirit, they start worshiping an item, a man-made item. They start creating household gods within their own house, which is a typically Canaanite pagan thing. The pagan people of antiquity had many gods, man-made gods, but they also had each family kind of their own household gods. This is a characteristic that Micah and his mother imitate, and then they even convince a Levite priest to become their own personal priest, so they find their own personal way to get to God. And when this happens, of course, disaster ensues when you choose, I'm going to go to God my own way. Moral corruption. That's what the latter part of the book of Judges is all about, and it's hard to read. It's outrageous, it's vile, disgusting, sordid, grotesque. Those are some of the words that we describe, for example, what happens at Gibeah, which is kind of reminiscent of kind of the story of Sodom, of utter sexual depravity, which is punished by God, but actually this seems, maybe if it can be, seem even worse. And it shows the total devastating toll that corruption brings upon the children of Israel. Here's the story in quick, a highlight when he reached home. This is the Hebrew Levite. He took a knife, cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts, sent them to all the areas of Israel. And everyone who saw it was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine, we must do something, so speak up. So there's a call to, we have hit rock bottom with one of our own doing something like that. How far are we gone? We've got to fix this. The sad way in which Judges end, we anticipated, is the following. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. A terrible end. It's not about monarchy or a king or the last part of that statement. Everyone did as they saw fit is the recipe for utter disaster from a human, cultural, religious, emotional perspective. It is a horrendous place to be. What to apply from Joshua? The first book we looked at, trust God, live courageously. It's going to take courage to live by His word, and He will enable us to accomplish the purpose that He has for us. It is critical to seek the leading of God through His word. You can't make it up. You can't fudge it. You can't do part of it. You've got to follow God in every detail that He gives. What to apply again from Joshua? Trust God, live courageously, and critical to seek the leading of God. Sorry if I repeated that. What to apply from the second book, Judges? Turn from God and trusting in ourselves is a recipe for disaster, is a total disaster. So do it at your own peril. Here are people that did. Here's a whole nation of people that did. See where it led them. And by the way, when you find yourself regretting the decision that you made to turn from God, repentance is required. Without repentance, our lives will continue to spiral downward. It is possible for things to get worse. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 8. I'll read it and we'll conclude. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Here's the recipe for success. There is no other recipe for success for the people of God, human beings. You have to keep the book of the law always in your lips. Meditate it every day. Be careful to do everything that is written in it. This concludes chapter 5.